All of my content is also posted on 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, and custom Magic the Gathering tokens and playmats. As a subscriber to my channel, you can use the discount code Nizzahon5 for a 5% discount in their store. You can find the link in the description below. Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Nizzahon's Idle Thoughts. This time, I'm going to look at and analyze the decks from the top 8 of Pro Tour Kaladesh, which was last weekend. Before we actually look at those deck lists, let's talk about the card that has so far defined the very early period in this format, and a card that many people have already called a banning for, and that is Smuggler's Copter. It appears in the tons of top 8s at lower level tournaments in Magic the Gathering, as well as at Star City Games tournaments and local FNMs and things, and because of it, aggro seemed to be the deck that was best positioned for this new standard. But people came prepared for Smuggler's Copter, and cards that would not be main deckable in most situations, such as Ceremonious Rejection and Negate, showed up in main decks as a way of combating the Copter, as did removal spells that would normally not be playable, like Immolating Glare. As a result, the Copter was not quite as dominant at the Pro Tour as it was at events earlier on in the formats, but despite all the hate, it still managed to appear in 4 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour Kaladesh, indicating that, hate it or not, the Copter is probably here to stay in the new standard. Now let's look at the deck list for the top 8 of this Pro Tour. Let's start with one of the cooler decks in the top 8, which is, of course, my opinion, and that is Pierre Daugen's Blue-Red Spells. This deck is one of several featuring the new Torrential Gearhulk, who has proven to be the most played Gearhulk of the cycle so far. This is obviously also one of the 4 decks in the top 8 that isn't an aggro deck, and thus doesn't run the Copter. This deck is pretty sweet, running as many instants and sorceries as possible, many of which are powerful removal spells, like Lightning Axe, which can be used to kill things like Sky Sovereign and, of course, the Smuggler's Copter, and cantrips like Take Inventory. What makes this deck really, really sweet, though, is that it makes use of Dynavolt Tower as its win condition, a really sweet new card from Kaladesh that pays you off for playing all of those spells. So basically, this deck aims to just burn the opponent out with a ton of energy generated from playing 24 instants and sorceries. A very fun deck, and one that matches up pretty well against the aggro of the format, since it can efficiently kill basically all of the creatures that show up in those decks while building up energy to win the game, and the deck only has to run 1 creature. It doesn't need to run creatures at all, and that's basically why it doesn't run the Copter. Next, we look at a deck that is more or less an unchanged version of the Red-White Vehicles deck that dominated tournaments before the Pro Tour. A Vehicles deck that just runs all of the powerful vehicles around, including our friend Smuggler's Copter, as well as Fleet Wheel Cruiser, and also plays a bunch of good, aggressively crossed creatures who can either crew those vehicles or get in for a bunch of damage. We're not going to spend a much of time on this one, as it is more or less the deck that anyone who's been playing Standard the last few weeks is already familiar with. The other Vehicles deck in the top 8 is more or less the same, but it makes the interesting change of playing Cultivator's Caravan over the Cruiser or something like Sky Sovereign, and splashes black for a couple of powerful cards, Unlicensed Disintegration and Scrap Heap Scrounger. Vehicles are definitely here to stay and seem to be one of the decks capable of winning the most quickly in the current Standard format. Next, we look at the only deck from the top 8 that I would characterize as mid-range. This deck is also the one on the list, the most like a deck from the old Standard, as it is more or less a descendant of the Blue-White Spirits deck from pre-Kaladesh Standard. But this deck opts to run Smuggler's Copter in lieu of more Spirit synergies like Mausoleum Wanderer. This deck looks like it has a solid chance against most of the decks in the format. Reflector Mage and Spell Queller are still 2 of the best cards around in Standard, and they still match up fairly well against most of the new decks around. This deck can win just by curving out aggressively, but what makes it a little more mid-range is that it can also win in the later game thanks to 4 Archangel Avacynths. Next, we move to a less vehicle-centric take on Red-White Aggro. This deck focuses instead on going wide, using cards like Servo Exhibition, Pia Nalar, and Gideon Ally of Zendikar to do it, and then either using Gideon's Emblem or Reckless Bushwhacker to swing for massive damage. As is the case with all creature-based decks in the format, this one also runs Smuggler's Copter. One of the more interesting cards on the list is Outnumber, a card that saw virtually no play until now, but a token-based deck that has red in it can make pretty great use of the card, making it a very efficient removal spell in this deck, hence the fact that there are 4 in this particular deck. Next, we move to another deck that has to be a candidate for sweetest deck to make it to the top 8. Like the Blue-Red Spells deck, this deck focuses on winning the game with a new artifact from Kaladesh that both produces and uses energy, Aetherworks Marvel. This thing is great, and the main goal of the deck is to use it to cast either Ulamog or Emrakul as early as possible. Since the Marvel says that you play the card without paying its mana cost, that means you also get both cards' amazing cast triggers, meaning you either get to exile 2 permanents or take your opponent's next turn. The deck runs lots of ways to make energy, such as the Puzzle Knots, which combo well with the Marvel since they also go to the graveyard, giving you even more energy. The deck also packs in 3 Kozilek's returns, and I think this is key, so that it can have some fighting chance against the more aggressive decks in the format, while trying to cheat a big Eldrazi into play. This deck also runs one of the cards I would have told you anyway, that had virtually no chance of showing up in Constructed, and that is Contingency Plan. But it actually works really well with the Aetherworks Marvel, as you can increase greatly your chance of hitting one of your big Eldrazi with the trigger. The last 2 decks to make the top 8 are more or less traditional control decks, and that's a little refreshing to see because that was something that was sort of missing from the most recent standard format. Carlos Romau's Jeskai control deck does what you expect a control deck to do. It runs 5 board sweepers, including 2 Fumigates and 3 Radiant Flames, and it runs a ton of spot removal too, like Harness Lightning and Immolating Glare. It also packs in some counter magic, like Void, Shatter, and Summary Dismissal. Once this deck has kept you from doing what you wanted to do, it either drops an Archangel Avacyn or a Torrential Gearhulk to win the game. Even better is the fact that both cards have Flash, allowing you to leave up mana all the time and only cast a win condition when the conditions are right. Both cards also give you some value, with Avacyn being able to eat a creature and not die herself, and the Gearhulk being capable of doing the same, while also giving you a free instant out of your graveyard. Finally, we conclude with another control deck, this one Grixis, and a fairly unique deck run by a guy who tends to show up with his own brews and do well with them on a regular basis, a man who's a Hall of Famer, Shota Yosaoka. Running many of the same cards as the Jeskai deck, including Radiant Flames and Torrential Gearhulk, this deck adds black for access to a very powerful card draw spell that we used to see a couple cycles ago in Standard, and that is Painful Truce, and powerful spot removal spell, Unlicensed Disintegration. Like the Jeskai deck, this deck seeks to win the game with just a few cards in the deck, namely the Gearhulk Thing and the Ice, who actually matches up pretty well against the vehicles decks. Since you can find a way to transform it at instant speed and bounce their vehicles to their hand, as well as the creatures who are crewing them, and there's Thing in the Ice for you. On the whole, this new Standard looks more dynamic than what we left behind. While we have perhaps traded Collected Company for Smuggler's Copter, a greater variety of decks seems capable of succeeding in this format, with real control decks being more plausible now than they were before. Collected Company was so good that it made it so but a creature-based deck was really the only way it could go. Smuggler's Copter, while good, is not quite forcing people in that direction. And the fact that 2 really sweet new Kaladesh cards that make use of energy have already broken into the scene is great as well. Well, that does it for this edition of Nizzahon's Idle Thoughts. If you found this video interesting or useful, don't forget to click the like button. If you have any questions or comments about the new standard, post them in the comments below. And if you want to make sure you catch future editions of Nizzahon's Idle Thoughts, as well as other great Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.